There are still a number of potential presidential candidates who are considering entering the Democratic race, including, perhaps most famously, Joe Biden, who is reportedly still mulling over his decision, and Beto O'Rourke, who says he'll have an announcement soon. And today, Stacey Abrams said that a 2020 presidential run is, quote, on the table. When I hear that, I always wonder what exactly the period of contemplation looks like and how someone makes the decision, one way or the other, to run for president. Because not everyone decides to do it. Like, for instance, Ohio Senator Sherrod Brown, who toured the country on a Dignity of Work tour while considering a run and then announced he would not run last week. How did he make that decision? Well, Democratic Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio joins me now.
Hi, Chris.
Senator, I'm really curious about this, what goes into the calculation, because you constantly hear reports about people, they're talking to their advisors and they're talking to fundraisers and they're going out and talking to people. What is in your head? What did you come to believe through the process that led to your decision?
Well, as you know, Chris, I haven't had a lifelong dream to be president. I've known you a long time. You've never heard me. Nobody that I know has heard me talk about it as something I wanted to do at some point in my life. And that began to change in November, December, when I saw that just thought Democrats weren't talking to workers enough. And we don't win. I don't think we win in the South. I don't think we win in the Mountain West or the Midwest if we don't talk to workers better and listen to workers better and workers of all races. So, and I announced on this show, on the Chris Hayes Show, a couple of months ago, our Dignity of Work listening tour, and I underline listening because we really spent a lot of time in each of the 4 early states, New Hampshire, Iowa, South Carolina, Nevada, listening to people. And this whole idea of the dignity of work, we wanted this to become the narrative for other candidates. And I consider it a victory in the sense that so many other candidates now are talking about work, talking about the dignity of work. If you love your country, you fight for the people who make it work. And I've chosen to do that in the Senate. I think that I can have a loud voice there.
But at some point you were considering not doing that. I mean, I guess the question is, like, do you draw up a spreadsheet? Do you make a pros and cons list? Like, what is the thing that tips one over when making such a monumental decision?
I think it's the question of what are you willing to go through? What are you willing to put your family through? I think that the sort of joyful way I try to do my job in the Senate. I didn't feel that I could do the presidential race quite the same way and be effective. And so the decision was, and I know everybody gets to it differently. I think a lot of it is I just didn't have this huge desire to be president of the United States. I love the job in the Senate. I think I'm effective. I think that our dignity of work narrative, partly because we started on this show, has become a much bigger thing than it would have been. So I just think I'm ready to continue to do this in the Senate.
When you talk about that, I wonder, was there pressure? I mean, you won this race. You were just reelected in Ohio. I think part of the reason people talked about you as a possible presidential candidate was because you have this record where you have been a fairly liberal senator. If you look at voting record and things like that, in a state that has gone trended increasingly conservative and red. You just got reelected. You clearly have a connection with that state. You're able to sort of message your politics and connect to voters there. Were you getting any pushback from Chuck Schumer or anyone else about, if you were to win this thing, we'd be down a seat in Ohio that we'd have a real hard time replacing because a Republican governor would appoint your successor?
No, I heard that literally from nobody. I was questioned about it by media, but nobody said, hey, including people in Ohio and including Senate Democratic leadership, nobody said to me, you can't do this. I think partly because we'd be glad in this time to trade a Senate seat for the presidency. And I think that there was a recognition that if I were the nominee, I'd have perhaps the best chance to beat Trump. But I think that if this dignity of work theme, if people learn to talk, I mean, I want people to I want our candidates to start thinking about the general election and how you're going to win the general election. And if they start talking to workers, of course we play to the progressive base. I take a back seat to nobody on my vote against the Iraq War and for marriage equality and against NAFTA and against the bankruptcy bill and a whole bunch of those issues as a progressive. But we've got to talk to workers. If we do that, I predict, if we do that right, I predict that whoever raises her hand or his hand on January 20th, 2000, what year would it be? 2021, that they will talk about the dignity of work in her or his his inaugural speech.
Sharpen that, though, because it sounds to me like what you're trying to say is you're sharing, like, look, Democrats need to be thinking about a way to talk to voters broadly and appeal broadly. And you have an experience where you're running in a place like Ohio where there's a bunch of different constituencies and people of different political leanings. And as opposed to what is the thing that you're worried the field has been doing or is going to do that you're trying to provide an antidote to that you think is bad? You see what I'm saying?
I don't say it's bad yet. I might become that. I don't think that our candidates are thinking of the general election. I think that there is a bit of one bird flies off the telephone wire, 5 more birds fly off the telephone wire. I think there's a little bit of that. I just want candidates to think for themselves and to move the country forward and think about the general election and realize that even though I have a lifetime F from the NRA, I get gun owners' votes in some significant number in Zanesville and Mansfield and Lime, Ohio, because I talk about education and I talk about keeping their health care costs down and going after the drug companies and how do you send your kid to community college, to Zane State or to Rhodes State in Lima. How do you do that? And it really is, it's actually, I mean, this tour we did really was a listening tour. I wasn't trying to get the biggest crowds. I was listening to people and I learned stuff. One woman in Laconia, New Hampshire said, who'd run a child care facility for years, said, you got to think about child care as a public good. Yeah. We invest in transportation. We invest in public parks. We need to invest in child care. And the irony of child care is people can't afford it. And then the workers that provide it aren't making a living wage. So something's wrong there.
All right, Senator Sherrod Brown, it's always a pleasure to have you on. Thanks for taking
Chris.
time. Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.